And one of the points about the general election is that the rules are constantly evolving. There was an Elections Act last year that made some quite important changes to election rules. It made one very big change to the rules for electing mayors, and a lot of mayors are up for election this May, which is that those elections are now first past the post rather than proportional representation. And that change has already bitten. The mayor of Bedford, Lib Dem Dave Hodgson, was defeated precisely because he couldn't get transfer votes in an election in 2023. So those kind of things can make a bit of a difference. So Ruth, first of all, talk us through what's changed.
One big change that was introduced through the Elections Act was voter ID, which we have had experience of at the last local elections, but it will be the first general election where we will have to all turn up at the polling station with our voter identification.
So this is what, a passport, a driving licence?
Yeah, so you've got to have some form of photographic ID, but only particular types of voter ID are permitted, so you can't just rock up with anything.
And there have been complaints about this. I mean, for example, a policeman couldn't show a warrant card, and that would be sufficient identity, which seems slightly bizarre.
Yeah, so they're quite narrow, and particularly quite narrow for young people. So one of the criticisms was that there was more flexibility for older people in terms of what they could show, but not for younger people in terms of voter identification. At the local elections, 4% said in research, I think it was for the Electoral Commission, that voter ID was a reason that they had not voted. And one of the problems is that in that there's a sort of a concern about a significant share of them being, if you like, disengaged groups, underrepresented groups, the disabled, the unemployed, and people who might naturally have more difficulty in getting the particular forms of ID.
Might not have a car, don't therefore have a driving licence, don't travel abroad, don't have a passport, therefore.
So that's been one of the criticisms, that the forms of ID are too narrow, and quite a number of parliamentary committees have looked at this, both when the legislation was going through and were quite critical, and the House of Lords Constitution Committee just before Christmas has written quite a long letter to the Minister expressing concern about this and asking them to look at it.
I do know that there's been concern, MPs I've talked to have been saying this, that there is a way that if you're, for example, an old age pensioner, you can get a kind of surrogate ID that you can use to vote in elections, and the take-up for that has apparently been minuscule, and a lot of MPs are quite concerned that a lot of their elderly voters are going to rock up to the polling station, find they can't vote, get sent away, not come back.
Well, of course, the criticism at the time was that the government did this without a lot of consultation. The opposition weren't particularly happy with it. And there was that sort of feeling, is this a form of gerrymandering to aid older voters? But then they found at the local elections that actually it was some of the older voters who had more problems with this, because, of course, they've not got any experience of having to bring photo ID over the many years they've been voting to the polls, and it came as a big shock. And it was interesting, at the National Conservatism Conference last summer, Jacob Rees-Mogg said in his speech, parties that try and gerrymander end up finding their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. So the implication was that they might have been gerrymandering. We found the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative, so we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well.
And that's just one strand of the whole set of issues floating over the upcoming general election. More widely, there's just a general concern about things like foreign interference, social media being used as a channel for foreign governments to try and muscle in and influence British elections, about the level of donations that are allowed, about a whole series of concerns that might allow a general election to be influenced in a way perhaps voters wouldn't be entirely keen on if they knew about it.
Yeah, so one of the issues is around campaign spending levels and the kinds of donations that can be made and the levels at which they have to be registered. And one of the big issues is around what's called unincorporated associations. These are bodies that can donate, well, it was originally £25,000, the spending limit. It's now been raised to £37,000 as a result of a recent regulation that's gone through Parliament. Those associations have to identify gifts over £7,500 from a single source in a 12-month period. But only individual donations of £500 or more count. So you can get round that by making donations under the £500 limit.
So £499.99.
Yeah. And you can make those multiple times throughout the year, and you don't then have to declare it. So the Committee on Standards in Public Life a couple of years ago said that these unincorporated associations are a route for foreign money to influence our elections, and said that there's just a lack of transparency over that. Now, one of the concerns there is that the limit has been raised as part of a wider picture of increasing spending levels for the forthcoming election. So the political parties have now got a much higher national spending cap. It's gone up from 19.5 million to 35 million, Now, bear in mind, at the last general election in 2019, the Conservative Party spent more than any other party, and that was 16.5 million. So they were under the national cap last time. That national cap has now gone up considerably. So are we going to see a huge splurge? Is that the plan? The Electoral Commission's not very comfortable with this. The government's argument is, look, we are simply raising the levels in line with inflation, which the Act does permit. That's what they're supposed to do.
This was all done completely without debate as well,
yeah,
wasn't it?
But why was it not raised in terms of inflation in previous years? Why are we suddenly doing it now when we've not done it automatically in other years? And yes, because it's an inflation-linked increase, the regulation, the statutory instrument, didn't even have to be laid before Parliament under the terms of the legislation. If the Electoral Commission had approached the government and said, we have got a concern about spending levels, we think you need to raise the cap, that regulation would have had to be laid before Parliament. But we've now ended up, conversely, in the rather odd situation where an automatic operating doesn't have to be laid before Parliament, and the Electoral Commission has got concerns about it, but parliamentarians can't debate it unless it goes through an opposition day debate or is otherwise raised. But the actual text of the regulation for this won't be debated.
The role of the Electoral Commission in all this is quite interesting because it was set up to be a kind of watchdog and overseer and non-party body that would comment on the running of elections and hopefully avoid gerrymandering and baleful changes to regulations. But it seems to have emerged as the quango that MPs hate most, and that's quite a high bar.
I mean, the Hansard Society takes a big interest in this because the original proposals for an electoral commission, we published a paper in the 1990s by our then chair, Professor David Butler, of course, the great psophologist, the man who was seen on our TV screens at election nights. He invented the swingometer. David wrote a paper proposing an electoral commission to provide independent regulation for our election systems. And yes, it has grown to be hated. I mean, one of the things I think is that certainly in its early years, there was a feeling among MPs, among the parties, that a number of the staff and the board of the Electoral Commission didn't really understand how elections worked. It was almost too independent, too non-partisan.
Too unworldly.
Yeah, they just didn't get politics, and they didn't get, party campaigning on the ground and the complexities of operating a national campaign with a professional team, a professional staff, party headquarters, but having to implement that on the ground with essentially volunteer parties and local constituency members who were giving their time freely involuntarily.
And having perhaps local agents who are having to navigate an incredibly complex set of rules and produce a detailed return of their election spending according to those rules, while perhaps not entirely understanding them.
Yeah, and the sanctions are heavy. You can go to prison if you're not declaring things properly or get your calculations wrong. But it's interesting this time, the chair of the Electoral Commission, John Pullinger, of course, who you and I know because he's a former House of Commons official, former House of Commons librarian, he has done an interesting interview with the House magazine in which he expresses concern about the legislative framework underpinning the election system. He calls it archaic. It's long been calls for the legislative system to be sort of updated, for all the electoral legislation to be consolidated in one act rather than found in disparate places. And he talks about the risk of an election failure rising, that something bad could happen because of the layers of complexity that now exist. And
the implications of that are incredibly poisonous, because if people start to question the legitimacy of a general election and therefore the legitimacy of whatever government emerged from it, you really are in a completely different ballgame. Has there ever been a general election where the outcome has been widely queried as totally wrong and fixed and gerrymandered?
No. I mean, you have had individual sort of local election campaigns where things have clearly gone wrong and they've had to be inquiries, but generally not a general election. But one of the concerns that John Pullinger expresses is the sort of the funding, the returning officers on the ground in each constituency are essentially local government officers. Local government runs the election officers for registration, for voter ID, for, a lot of the sort of the regulatory and transparency and accountability aspects of the process, making sure that people are registered, dealing with postal votes, dealing with proxy votes. And he says they're under, as we know, serious financial and staffing pressures. And the more tasks and complexities that are imposed on them, often at short notice, often sometimes, even some of these regulations, it doesn't give them an awful lot of time to implement them by the time that these regulations will come into force. It increases the risks at each individual constituency level.
And of course, all the spending on this has to come at the expense of perhaps other services, other spending priorities for local councils. This is one of my minor bets, and I'll be very interested to see how this unfolds in the forthcoming general election, is how many councils decide they can save a few grand by having their count the next day rather than by counting overnight, which rather takes the wind out of election programmes that evening if there's only a handful of places where the results are going to be declared. But you can save quite a lot of money if you're not paying through the night overtime to the people who are counting your votes.
Yeah, absolutely. The other sort of area that's come under criticism is donations to political parties and the risks of overseas political influence. And one of the arguments being made is that political parties should be subject to some of the sort of same anti-money laundering legislation that, for example, charities like the Hansard Society are. And the argument from the political parties is, we're obviously at local level with voluntary organisations, we're quite small in terms of constituency associations, and the counter-argument to that is, well, so are a lot of charities, so are a lot of other sort of community groups, so are a lot of small businesses that are subject to these same regulations. So is there a bit of hypocrisy here on the part of the political parties?
That is one of the things, I mean one of my fantasy political reforms, because I'm the sort of person who has fantasy political reforms, would be to take money out of politics as much as possible and make the political parties much more dependent on small donations and have the incentive to get hundreds of thousands of small donors rather than simply raking in a couple of billion from some random billionaire who took a bit of an interest in politics, whether because they were genuinely committed or whether because they were taking a sort of dilettantish idea that it might be quite nice to get involved for a while and play with politics. So I would like to see a system that depended on having lots of people prepared to work for a political party and lots of people being prepared to give modest amounts and a strong cap on how much could be given by any single individual or interest.
Well, of course, one of the ways that it's done in other countries is you get a tax benefit by donating to a political party in the same way that if you donate to a charity. Why not the same for politics? A lot of the debate and the discussion around this is that, politics is a bit dirty, a bit murky. What is critically important, it affects all our lives, and it should be seen as a civic duty rather than something that is the preserve of rich people in dark corners.
And, if you go back several decades to the days when political parties had membership in the hundreds of thousands or even millions, then it was quite easy for them to raise enough money to run campaigns. Well, easy may be an overstatement, but it was more possible for them to raise that kind of money from their membership and wider support group than it has since become. Now political parties are rather hollowed out institutions, sometimes with only a few tens of thousands of members. That just isn't really the way you can run a credible national campaign anymore.
No. And then we come to another reform that's been introduced that does have implications in terms of donations, and that's the changes to the rights of overseas citizens to vote. So British citizens living abroad, they're going to remove the 15-year limit on British citizens living overseas being eligible to vote. Now, again, that's sort of regulations that are just coming through now in Parliament under the Powers in the Elections Act 2022. The figures are suggested that this could affect 3.4 million people. So you could be importing...
That's an awful lot of voters.
Yeah, and one of the concerns here is which seats will they vote in? How do you, particularly if you've been abroad for 15 years or more, how do you prove and demonstrate a link to a particular constituency? And there's a process called attestation, which is basically somebody else in the constituency sort of attests on your behalf that, yes, you do have this link. And the feeling is that that's actually quite weak. At the time when we've all got to rock up at the polling station with photographic ID, in order for somebody abroad to vote, they've just simply got to, in a particular constituency, they've just simply got to say, I've got this link with this person in this particular constituency. So there's a feeling that it's making it easier for them. At the same time, we're making it harder for citizens resident in the UK to participate.
And it also gives parties a reason to have quite an elaborate organisation to try and muster their overseas support as well. And that's another thing that they end up having to spend money on. So again, it favours the better resource parties.
And again, going back to this whole business about the local election office managing this process, they're the ones that have got to look at and investigate the credibility of this attestation and whether in fact this person is indeed who they say they are and have got this link to their constituency. And again, that's then additional time, effort, resource that is imposed on the local election office to try and get that right.
There is a question too about choosing where you vote if you've got perhaps links in several different places. This was a complaint about the student votes.
Yeah.
Students voting in marginal university seats rather than in whatever safe seat their family might have come from originally may have tipped the balance in quite a lot of university constituencies. Canterbury is the example a lot of people point out, which rather startlingly went from perpetually Conservative seat to suddenly being Labour in 2017. Now, those kind of arguments also apply here. Could you choose to go to a place that you have some connection with if you've lived at several different places in Britain?
Yeah.
You
Choose
go and
which one.
choose the most marginal seat where you want your vote to have the most influence.
Yeah. And as we know, in some of these seats, we're talking about a couple hundred votes being the difference. That could be the difference for a really well-organised campaign between hanging on and losing.
And it's one of the things that sometimes emerges after elections, that a bit of organisational effort in a certain place can be the thing that can be said to have tipped the balance. In the Brexit referendum, a lot of Brexiteers pointed to the efforts they'd made to up the Leave vote in Northern Ireland. While the majority of the vote in Northern Ireland was for Remain, a bigger than expected Leave contingent was fairly crucial in what was, after all, quite a tightly fought referendum.
Yeah. And we talked in an earlier pod about the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill and changes to opt-in procedures for direct marketing. So we're all potentially facing an awful lot more campaign materials coming through our inboxes on the TV.
A tsunami of spam.
Yeah, and it's just interesting that's getting a little bit more focus now. The bill's heading off into House of Lords, that's starting to get some real focus. So we'll see what happens with that. And just finally, something to look out for once Parliament's back is that the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee has been doing some post-legislative scrutiny of the Lobbying Act, which was introduced 10 years ago. So it's its 10-year anniversary, and they're looking at whether there need to be changes to that legislation because it casts too narrow an umbrella over lobbying that has to be registered. It's not capturing in-house lobbying.
And the way this plays into a general election campaign is what organisations, charities, whatever, campaign groups can do in the course of a general election campaign. Are they allowed to campaign for their own priorities?
The committee, chaired by the Conservative MP William Ragg, who's not backwards at coming forwards in criticising the government where he thinks they're going wrong, they're looking at this. They've been doing an inquiry now for quite a while, and they're going to be coming forward with a report. We don't know the date, but sometime in the spring.
Yeah, William Ragg, interesting guy, because he's been a bit of a rebel for the government on a number of issues and is planning to leave Parliament at the next election.
And he's very young.
And he's very young, and he can go off and do plenty of other things. And so he hasn't got any particular reason to toe any party lines and not rock any, I'm mixing metaphors again, not rock any boats as the poll approaches.
Yeah, but depending upon what he says in his report, he may not be getting a job in lobbying.